War is not glorious. It's brutal, it's bloody, it's difficult, it's seriously unpleasant. An army is designed to fight. Nasty, dirty, taking casualties, being hit by IEDs. That's what an army has to go and do. Stuff goes wrong in war. Shit happens. My name's Stuart Tootal. I'm a former colonel in the Parachute Regiment. I'm also the author of a number of books. My latest book, The Last PARA, coming out by Penguin on the 29th of August, is a classic adventure wartime epic about an individual called John Humphreys, who had the most remarkable career, prisoner of war twice, mentioned in dispatches twice, North Africa, Tobruk, wounded, Arnhem, and most importantly, John was the last surviving Arnhem veteran to actually fight at the bridge for 4 savage days with the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment Group. Well, the idea from The Last PARA really came from meeting John Humphreys, who was the subject. And I've written a number of previous books where I take a subject, might be a corporal in D Squadron in the SES and Falklands War of 1982, and I get to really understand their story, and then I write the story as if I'm then in the first person, so there's complete immersion in that person's experiences, their character, and I've clearly built lots of research around it as well. And I met John Humphreys at the Royal Hospital Chelsea. He was a Chelsea pensioner there, and I didn't intend to write his story. I just met him, we started chatting, and I thought, gosh, this is such a fantastic story. An individual who joined the army as a 14-year-old boy in 1936, fought all the way through the war, which included being taken prisoner twice, fighting in North Africa, being wounded, winning 2 mentions in dispatches, and then being the last living, surviving veteran to actually fight at the bridge at Arnhem in September 1944. And as he just matter-of-factly told me his story, because I was asking about it, I thought, wow, there's a book to be written here. So I suggested to him that he might want to write his story and I might help him. And so John didn't do any of the writing. That was to me, and that was very much my job. So I spent 7 months seeing John probably at least once a week, every week, sometimes often twice, maybe 3 times. And we just went through his story. And when he talked about things, particularly when he may have had some amnesia, bearing in mind he was 102 when he sadly died in March last year, that I'd go and do all the research, I'd read the unit records, find out what was going on in his particular unit, then I'd ask him specific questions about it. And that was the genesis of the story. And he was this wonderful man who not only did he join the army at 14, but he then served, because he was a regular, he served not only throughout the war, but he then went on to go all the way through the ranks, becoming a late entry lieutenant colonel in the engineers, and retiring at the end of a 47-year career. So, I mean, quite a unique veteran, because when I've written about other Second World War veterans, they have been soldiers for the period of the war, where John was a regular, and that did bring a different dynamic to the book as well. When I've spoken and written about other veterans, and one example is a book called The Manner of Men about the 9th Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, jumping in Normandy, and I did 3 battlefield tour visits with 4 of the veterans who I became quite close to, and I knew there was quite a lot of collective storytelling and a degree of understandable embellishment, but these were men who had served during the Second World War as young men, teenagers. They had then left the army, had generally forgotten about their military experience because everyone was trying to forget about the war in the late 1940s and 1950s. And then in the 1960s, as these men began to reach their 40s and 50s, suddenly there was this great celebration of the Second World War, the Dam Buster films, The Great Escape, into the 70s, Bridge Too Far, etc. And they began to relive their stories almost as a collective whole. This is what the unit did, we then did this, we then did that. What's different about John's story? Very much an individual. This is what I did, from a 17-year-old to a 21, 22-year-old through the war. And he didn't talk a lot about associations. He was part of the association, but he was very much an individual, and it was his private recollections. And I think that makes it very unique that he was a soldier not just for the conflict, but he was a soldier for the whole of his professional life. Well, I focused on his full wartime career, so from when war was declared in 1939, with a capture of the fact he joined as a 14-year-old boy, sent from his parents from Singapore because his father was also a Royal Engineer, right up to his escape from Germany when he was captured after the fighting at Arnhem. And that's the concentration of the book. And then clearly the epilogue deals with the fact that he served on in the army for, full 47-year career. But the focus is very much on the wartime years. So John's recall was pretty good, but one has to take into account he was 100 years old. He's trying to remember events 80 plus years ago. So he had patches of amnesia, but also he was a Lance Sergeant, and then he got demoted as a result of being captured, which is an administrative thing. But he was a relatively junior NCO and a young man. So he didn't claim to have the full bigger picture of what Montgomery was doing with the 8th Army, or what Montgomery was then trying to do with Operation Market Garden. So I had to go and do my research to fill in that detail of why was a bigger strategic event having an impact on a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old corporal, and bringing all that alive through his characters, literally from what they were doing of collecting their kit together, getting ready for the jump, writing their last letters home, but setting that in the strategic context. And I think that's one of the things I've learned as a writer, that it's the writer's job to take the individual and their story and put it into the wider strategic context. But the last para is not about the campaign in North Africa from a strategic point of view, nor the campaign in Northwest Europe. But of course it gives the right level of strategic context to the story, but the focus is on the individual. This is a very human story, from packing your kit to shooting down a German in a half-track and what that was like. And so that's the beauty, if you like, of the collaboration. The essence of the story is absolutely the subject, but then my job as a writer is not only to get into their shoes, but bring it alive to the audience of this is the context of the setting in which these events took place. And I think, like most veterans you write about, their strategic horizons are very limited. A tank commander thinks about his troop, maybe what his squadron is doing. They're thinking about the next hedgerow, the next German gun position. They're not thinking about whether it's part of a big operational drive. And that's talking about an example of a young officer. As a corporal, yes, did John realise they were going to take a bridge at Arnhem? Yes. Airborne soldiers were probably far more involved in an understanding of the planning, but it was take a bridge, we hold the bridge for a couple of days, 2nd Army, 30 Corps get here, and then we've created an opportunity to end the war a year or so earlier by allowing Montgomery to bounce into the Rhine. Yes, I think there was a general understanding from what John told me about this, but in terms of who was the leading division of 30 Corps drive, what were the 82nd doing, what were the 101st doing, either in Nijmegen, Eindhoven, very little appreciation of that. Operation Market Garden was a very risky attempt to try and bounce a crossing over the Rhine, avoiding further to the south the main defensive German positions of the Siegfried Line, in simplicity. It was also the outcome of a dilemma that the Allied armies had after Normandy. They had a resupply problem. They had no ports. They were bringing all their logistics still across the beaches, and effectively they'd run out of fuel once 21st Army Group had got into Belgium, and also the US forces to the south. And Eisenhower had to make a decision. Did he back Bradley's army group, or did he back Montgomery? And I think he probably made the right call to back Montgomery. And it's very interesting because John's view, everyone sees Arnhem as a great disaster and a failure. And they're absolutely right. It did not achieve the objectives that Montgomery set out for it. But at the same time, you've got to reckon a risk in war. And it was a risky option. And a lot of things went wrong. Poor intelligence, trying to advance up a single route in a limited amount of time, a lack of appreciation of German resistance. But of course, as in war generally, it's about chance and that weird geometry. Had one or two things happened differently, there might have been a different outcome. And that was very much John's view. And I asked him, was it worth it? And bearing in mind John's squadron, 1st PARA Squadron Royal Engineers, jumped into Arnhem at 153 men strong. When the battle ended, 11 of them answered the roll call. That was the level of casualties. Everyone else was either dead, wounded, or captured. But even in those very stark and very grim statistics, John would say, well, it was worth it. It might have worked. And I think it's very easy to look back in hindsight and say, well, there were lots of challenges and obstacles for it to become a success. At the same time, there was a chance it could have worked. It didn't. So I'm not an apologist for Arnhem. I'm not someone, especially with a PARA background. While it was a fantastic battle and a great battle honour for the Parachute Regiment and Airborne Forces generally, I'm not someone who's going to say, yes, it could have absolutely worked, but you've got to reckon a risk in war. And that's what Montgomery was doing. And yes, there were mistakes, and some of those mistakes could have been avoided, but he went for it. And he was backed by Eisenhower as the Supreme Allied Commander, and it didn't work. Stuff goes wrong in war. Shit happens. Well, the odds against them were significant. If you think that Johnny Frost's 2nd Battalion group, probably by the time they collected all the available forces within the first 24 hours, probably never exceeded more than about 700, 750 men. And of course, the German speed of reaction, not just at the bridge, but stopping the other battalions, getting to them, 1st PARA, 2nd PARA, 3rd PARA. So with 2nd Battalion isolated on its own, 750 men fighting the rump of an SS Panzer division and components of both 9th and 10th SS PARA. So the odds were huge. And of course, the SS were equipped with armoured vehicles, significant artillery support. The Airborne's artillery support was very limited. It increased obviously as 30 Corps advanced up towards them and the bigger guns came into range. But that didn't happen until much later on in the battle. And then of course, despite the preponderance of Allied air superiority, air support around the bridge and around Arnhem generally throughout the period of the battle was very, very poor because of the weather, because of the difficulties of providing air support to friendly forces when they're so closely mixed with the fighting of enemy forces. But John commented on the lack of air support, which surprised them and disappointed them massively, where the Germans actually had reasonable air support during that period. John was very proud of what he did. He was very modest. I mean, he felt they gave up at the bridge too early. So his view was that they were fighting in a schoolhouse on the northern perimeter of the bridge. 75 men went in, roughly in total, mainly 1st Parachute Squadron, but also some soldiers from 3 PARA who managed to slip through, the 3rd Battalion. There was about a platoon there. When the house eventually collapsed, because it literally did, because it was being pulverised at point-blank range by Tiger tanks and was burning to the ground, and they had suffered scores of casualties, significant number of dead, and they'd run out of ammunition. And the senior officer at the time, an engineer captain called Eric Mackay, said, look, we're out of ammunition, chaps. There's only really about 10 of us still left fighting. Everyone else is either wounded or dead. Buildings burning and collapsing. I think now is the time that we're going to have to surrender. And John actually said, and he was very clear about this, he said, bugger that, I'm not giving up. As soon as I get a moment to get out of here, I'm getting out of here. And what he did was, and sorry, I'll rephrase that, he just said, I am not going to surrender. So rather than what he would probably consider as throwing in the towel, he decided to bolt into Arnhem to try and make it back to Allied lines, and he was captured. Then he subsequently escaped. But no, John was very clear of the view that, you know, they probably gave up a little too soon. And that's just John's individual perspective. I mean, what 2nd Battalion did, the 2nd Battalion group, was they displayed an awesome level of bravery. I mean, you know, they had to give up at the end. There were so few of them left. Their perimeter had shrunk to just 1 or 2 houses which were smouldering ruins. Virtually every commander was either dead or wounded. They had virtually run out of ammunition. I don't think they had any choice, but John's individual perspective was he wanted to keep on going, and that was the sort of guy that he was. I'm not sure that my experience may be the best person to write the book, but it certainly helped, and it helped on 2 levels. One, because I would never try and mirror or match my experiences, whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's Iraq, to what John and his generation went through, particularly, you know, John fought in North Africa at Tobruk, but also in Arnhem as well. But at the same time, there was an understanding. There was an appreciation about confusion, fog of war, being under fire. All of those things you could relate to. And you could ask questions of John. Did you ever feel like this? And he would go, well, you know, yes, I did. And writing about another veteran called David Rendon in a book called Tank Action, you know, David would say to me, well, what did you think? How did you find this from your experiences? And there was quite a similarity, at least for appreciation of understanding, which I was able to draw on because of my own particular experiences. Not that they, I think, ever measured up to John's. But then, of course, the other thing, and particularly with John, and John was a para engineer, but at the same time, the para airborne fraternity is a very close one. So there's an instant respect, you know, that John was aware that, you know, once upon a time I had wings on my arm, wore a maroon beret, that type of thing, all of which was sacred to him. And that made a real difference as well at the end of the day. That bond and fraternity, particularly of the airborne brotherhood, is strong. They call it the blood clot, and they call it the blood clot for a very good reason. Well, my view is that, you know, that it isn't, war is not glorious. You know, it's brutal, it's bloody, it's difficult, it's seriously unpleasant. But at the same time, there is an ability and an honour to it, which there has to be, in terms of, you know, the importance of history, you know, remembering what people did. I mean, even today, the parachute regiments still revere the veterans of Arnhem, and also other airborne battles as well, and some more recent for the Falklands. And that is really important, and it's not to me glorifying it, but it's remembering the significance of the sacrifice that people made. And so it's built into a regimental folklore and a history, and it serves as a really important example. And John was telling me about, and he only visited Arnhem twice after the battle in his much latter years, but he was telling me that he was reading the Memorial Visitors book in the Oostbeek Cemetery, and one line stood out to him, which was a young para soldier, probably writing at a time when he might have served in either Iraq or Afghanistan or possibly both, just said, in terms of John's generation, you set the standard. And that's really important. And John always said, well, I hope we did. And I said, yeah, as a former commanding officer of a para battalion, you absolutely did. You know, we would bring Arnhem veterans, Normandy veterans, to our medal ceremonies, whether it was coming back from Iraq or coming back of Afghanistan. And the importance to a young 18-year-old para Tom, private soldier, being told by a then 90-year-old veteran who jumped at Normandy, jumped on the Rhine, jumped in Suez, and of course jumped in Arnhem, for an old para veteran warrior telling a young gun that he was proud of what they had done in Afghanistan, made a huge amount to them. It's living history in the parachute regiment, and it made a difference in Afghanistan as well. Going up to difficult places like the town of Sangin in 2006, where supplies were short, we were running out of ammunition, casualties were mounting, combat fatigue was setting in. And you could talk to your soldiers and say, fellas, I know this is tough and we've got a stack load of challenges, and my job is to try and resolve some of those challenges, get you more people, get you more kit, get you more ammunition. But in the meantime, we've got to hold on and make do with what we've got. And when you turned to young paratroopers and said, and I know it's tough here, but think what it would have been like to the veterans of our sister battalion, 2 Para, at the end of that bridge in September 1944, surrounded by an SS division, and they fought themselves to annihilation. And young paratroopers would get it. They'd go, this is what we do. You know, we are living with the standard of performance that was set by our forebears. That it's not meant to be easy. This is why a parachute battalion is here in the first place. And there's a belt full of things going wrong and a stack load of risk, but that's why you're in the parachute regiment. Yeah? And people got it. And that ethos, that regimental history, actually became a collective handrail that people could reach out and touch. And while it's important, obviously, to lots of regiments to remember their histories from Waterloo, but it's so far ago. But this is living history. This is automatic weapons, machine guns, air support, so that people can relate to it. And while very, very sadly, there are very few veterans left now, certainly in the last decade or so, these veterans were coming to our regimental events. Enormously powerful. And we forget that memory and that ethos at our peril, I think. And I think one of the great things about the parachute regiment, you can see the light of battle in the eyes of an 18-year-old paratrooper who just came back from Afghanistan. And it's the same look that John Humphreys, a 102-year-old, had in his eyes as well. I wrote a book called Danger Close, which was just my experiences from commanding 3 Para. I just wrote it, and then someone wanted to publish it, which was great, and it was a collective story. It was hugely cathartic writing it. I wrote it soon after leaving the army. And then I tried to write a second book called The Man of Men, which I wrote and was published. But I found that enormously difficult, trying to write a collective history of one action, which was the assault on the Merville Battery, and a subsequent action of the defence of the Brayville Ridge in June 1944 with 9 Para. But then I remember meeting this chap called David Render, who was a 19-year-old Normandy veteran, fought all the way through as a Sherman tank commander. And I was beginning to think, how do I write this story? And someone said to me, in fact, it was the author Damien Lewis, who I know a little bit, he said, why don't you write it as if you're David? And that was a eureka moment. Writing it as the individual, suddenly you can bring the real power. And it's an enormous privilege, because you have the license, and I spent 5 days in Normandy with David driving his tank route. Sadly, I couldn't do this with John, because he was over 100 when I started writing the book. But even with John, I could turn around and say, John, at this moment, right here now, what did you feel? You knew the Germans might be on that ridgeline. What were you thinking? And David Render's case, because we were sitting in Normandy, he'd say, I'd be thinking, is there an 88 up there? Is it self-propelled? Is it a tank? Is it an anti-tank gun? Has it seen me? Will I see it before it fires? If it fires, will it hit me? If it hits my tank, is it going to wound the crew? if we're wounded, can we get out? Will we burn? Will we return fire in time? Where do we go? All these things they're thinking through. And the advantage of being someone with a military background, you have an appreciation that ground is important, ground threat, enemy capabilities, but then the individual bringing this alive, saying, at that moment in time, 80 years ago, I was sitting in my turret, engine humming behind me, radio crackling in my headset, looking out and going, is there a German 88 up in that hill? What's going to happen if it opens fires first? What am I going to do? And David found himself in those situations. So there is this huge privilege to being able to write and tell other people's stories. It gives me a great connection back with the military. But I would describe myself, I've written 5 books which are published. The last PARA is the latest. There is one, a 6th on the way about Jock Lewis and the SAS. We'll just have to wait and see what happens with that one. But it's whether it's a second career or it's I'm an amateur historian, writer, hobby, but I love it because you have this access to these wonderful people, and of course you're researching history, and it's a great connection back into the military. Which, so yeah, it's a nice addition to what I do. We lost people in Iraq, dead. We took a lot of wounded. People went through a very difficult time, and we should remember that, and people should be proud of their service in Iraq. I don't think we should celebrate Iraq as a great decision. It was an appalling decision. We took the eye off the ball. We should have focused on Afghanistan back in 2001. That had a clear link to 9/11. Iraq didn't. Poor intelligence, no one thinking through what happened after the major combat phase. And yeah, I think Iraq was a huge mistake, but that doesn't mean that those people who served there shouldn't be very proud. Yeah, they went out, volunteer army, professional soldiers, and they served. And some people paid the ultimate sacrifice, and we should never forget that. And people should be remembered and appreciated and thanked for that. And I think we need to divorce that away from the larger political context that, you know, Iraq may have been a mistake, and I think very personally that it was, and I'm very clear in my views there, having served there. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget about the people who served there and should have been proud to have done so as professional soldiers. It's what a professional army does, goes out and does the bidding of the nation. Well, I think there are actually lessons learned for the military as well. I mean, I think the military was pretty complacent in many ways. You saw it when we went into places like Al-Amara, that we weren't doing enough to stabilise the situation in law and order. We felt that we didn't have a role to play in that. We absolutely had a role to play. And, you know, there's jurisprudence from international law, the law of armed conflict and the obligations of belligerent occupier, and I don't think we thought through any of that. I think we forgot about our counterinsurgency lessons. I think we could have worked harder with the Iraqis and disbanding the Iraqi army, which may have been a political decision, but actually it's something that we, or certainly our senior commander, should have absolutely pushed back against. You know, that was a huge mistake to do that. And I think what it also shows is that the army has to drive the political decisions which will only result in consequences for themselves if they're poor decisions. So I think one of the lessons from Iraq is actually some of our military commanders should have done more to stand up, to challenge, to lead. And I think that's, so there are lessons both for the politics and, the politicians, but also the senior military. And clearly there are lots of tactical lessons to be learned as well. Was there a failure of acknowledging history in Afghanistan? Without a shadow of a doubt. In 2006, you mentioned 120,000 Russians couldn't contain Afghanistan, couldn't deliver what they set out to do. why should it be any different for us? Well, I think there were some differences, but the fundamental problem with Afghanistan is, one, the level of investment that we were beginning to make in 2006 to 2009 should have been made in 2001. But as I previously mentioned, we took the eye off the ball and we all charged off to Iraq, which was a mistake. Had we made that investment in Afghanistan in 2001, not just from a military point of view, but also from a civil development, socio-political investment as well, I honestly believe it may have still taken 20 to 30 years, but we would have been able to withdraw from Afghanistan, leaving Afghanistan not a liberal Western democracy, but a more stable polity that could stand on its own 2 feet and be a valuable member of the international community, and certainly, most importantly, not a haven for terrorists. But we didn't think through the history, we didn't think through the level of investment we needed to make, and of course by the time we started to invest just about the right force levels, which must have been around about 2009, so after our time there as the first UK battle group into Helmand province, it was too late. And David Cameron had already made the commitment that we were going to withdraw. I mean, I get he probably had no other alternative given the political situation. But we were on a hiding to nothing from 2009 anyway, because the Taliban just had to wait. And that's exactly what they did. I'm enormously proud of serving in Afghanistan, and more importantly, proud of the people I served with. But I'm a professional soldier. Was a professional soldier. So my job in 2006 was to follow the political direction, which was to go to Afghanistan. And every soldier wants to go on operations who's worth their soul. So I think from a professional point of view, I regret nothing. It is unfortunate that it couldn't have been better conceived, better resourced, some of the things that I mentioned. But of course, if you asked a wife whose husband didn't return from that tour, or a mother, or someone who was badly wounded or mentally scarred, then they may give you a very different answer, and I would completely understand that. I think the history will probably in many ways understandably be very unkind to Afghanistan from a political and military strategic level. There are a belt full of mistakes that were made. I would like to think history will reflect very positively on the performance of individual soldiers and units. I'm not just talking about the Parachute Regiment, I'm talking about the Royal Marines and other army units as well, and brilliant support we had from RAF Chinooks, for example, and especially the Americans and their A-10s. All of that should be looked on positively from a tactical level. What people put into that campaign, the difficulties of it, all should be remembered, and people should be recognised for that. We need to remember, though, that lessons came out of that campaign. An army is designed to fight, yeah? Nasty, dirty, whether it's slogging up the Sangin Valley, taking casualties, being hit by IEDs, and doing it on very, very little water and running out of ammunition, 45 degrees body heat. That's what an army has to go and do. Just as John had to fight in a burning house on the Arnhem Bridge. And we must never lose sight of that. That is the major rationale of a military force. And that's what the British Army needs to do. And it needs to remember that. It needs to remember that in how it recruits, the people it recruits. And it's really important that we have diverse recruiting. That's really important. But we have to ask ourselves, are we recruiting, and we must recruit, people who are capable of doing that. And it doesn't matter whether it's September 1944 in Holland or it's Afghanistan in the 2000s or wherever else the army may go next. Having people who will cross the line of departure is the key driver of everything. Yeah, it should drive your standards, who you recruit, how you recruit. And there are lots of different diverse people who can do that, but you need to make sure that regardless of people's backgrounds, and it's absolutely right that we have people from multiple, diverse background who fill the ranks of our army, but they need to be able to deliver that. And that's the #1 objective of any commander. Yeah? And we would forget that at significant cost, not just to the nation, but those people who serve as well. Anyone who has any interest, slightest interest in defence and also in the well-being of this country, we have an under-resourced military. We have a military which is too woke. And what I mean by that, and let's be really clear, the military needs to be diverse. But I don't agree that a military has to reflect the society it defends. Who would want it to, given some of the things that we see today around us? It must be diverse. It must have lots of different people, whether gender, sexual orientation, ethnic background. It must be diverse. But we mustn't drop standards to meet quotas, because we do so at our peril. And if we want to be more diverse, if the military wants to be more diverse in its recruiting, then it needs to invest more money in that. Because it's absolutely right, there are some really quality people who perhaps the military aren't reaching from more diverse backgrounds that they should bring in. But to do things on quotas, just to say, well, we're going to have 10%, but we're not going to have the funding to do that, because you need more resources to penetrate into some of these more diverse communities. People need to make that investment, because the key watchword is do not drop your standards. Pursue diversity, absolutely yes, but not at the cost of standards. And I believe, and I see this from lots of young officers and NCOs who are leaving the army today and come and speak to me about beginning a civilian career, will talk about this, and they think there is a dilution of standard. And we mustn't do that. There are some fantastic, and always will be some fantastically great young people out there, but don't let them down. Yeah? Keep the standards up, give them what they're joining the military to do, to go out and fight, whether it's equipment, whether it's human resources policies, whatever it might be, whether it's training. But we should never lose sight of that core focus of what an army is about, and it is to deliver operational capability on the battlefield, however demanding. It's an easy sop to say it's all about technology and cyber capabilities. Of course, that is true, that we need those capabilities and we need to invest in them, but equally we need to invest in people. Military operations are still boots on the ground, intensive affairs. Afghanistan taught us that. We never had enough people. The army is way too small. Yeah? And sadly, the trend will be to continue to cut it. But people need to fight for the numbers. You know, you need an army. It was 147,000 strong when I joined it. Maybe you don't need that many people. Maybe you can't really justify that many people. But you need an army in excess of 100,000. Yeah. Ukraine has demonstrated that. You know, lessons of history all around us. Yeah. Ukraine-Russia conflict has a huge technological aspect, but it's still about soldiers grinding away, grunting in trenches, tank-on-tank engagements. None of that has been made obsolete. Of course, technological changes will change things, but it's still about the raw quality of the individual human being. It's not just about having the standards, you're absolutely right. It's also about having the right numbers.